What if building wealth after 60 has less to do with what you buy and more to do with what you finally stop doing? Most financial advice aimed at senior men focuses on addition. Add this investment, add this income stream, add this strategy. But after decades of living, working, saving, and learning things the hard way, you already know a truth that younger men haven't discovered yet. Sometimes the fastest way to build wealth isn't to add more. It's to stop leaking what you already have. The traps that quietly drain a senior man's wealth are rarely dramatic. They don't look like disasters. They look like ordinary decisions: a loan to a son, a subscription he forgot he had, an investment he's too proud to sell, a lifestyle that expanded just slightly faster than his income did. This isn't a video about getting rich. It's a video about getting free. By finally seeing the traps that have quietly cost senior men more than any market crash ever could. There's a deep instinct in a father to solve his child's problems, no matter how old that child becomes. It doesn't fade with age. If anything, it grows stronger, tangled up with guilt, love, and the quiet fear of being seen as unavailable. A retired contractor, 68 years old, had helped his son financially more times than he could count. A car repair here, a late rent payment there, then a larger sum to cover a business debt his son swore would be the last time. It wasn't. Sitting at his kitchen table one evening, reviewing his retirement account balance, he realized he had transferred nearly $40,000 to his son over 6 years. Money that would have otherwise remained invested, growing quietly in the background of his life. He didn't regret loving his son. He regretted never asking himself a single question before writing each check. Am I helping him, or am I simply making his problem disappear so I don't have to feel his pain? Epictetus taught, wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. But it also consists in something else: clarity, about which wants are truly yours to solve, and which belong to someone else's life to work through. The contractor didn't stop loving his son. He simply started asking one question before every request: is this a gift I can afford to give freely, or a debt I'm quietly resentful about later? A father's love is not measured by how many checks he writes. There's a strange kind of loyalty men develop toward investments that have disappointed them. Selling feels like admitting defeat. Holding on feels like patience. But sometimes, what looks like patience is simply an unwillingness to accept a mistake has already happened. A man in his early 70s had held shares in a company for over 15 years. The stock had fallen significantly from its peak, and every financial instinct told him to sell and reallocate the money elsewhere. But he couldn't. He'd bought it with his late wife. During a conversation he still remembered clearly, and selling it felt like erasing something of her. His financial advisor, gently, asked him one question: if you didn't already own this, would you buy it today? He sat with that question longer than he expected to. The honest answer was no. He wasn't holding an investment. He was holding a memory, and calling it a financial decision. This is what behavioral economists call the endowment effect. The tendency to value something more simply because we already own it, regardless of what it's actually worth today. It's not a flaw unique to him. It's a pattern nearly every investor falls into, especially when emotion and money become tangled together. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth." Even our attachment to what we own is often more perspective than truth. He eventually sold the shares, and separately framed a photograph from that same year with his wife, keeping the memory without letting it quietly cost him money it no longer deserved to cost. Sometimes the most disciplined decision isn't holding on, it's finally letting go. After decades of working, saving, and delaying gratification, retirement can feel like permission. Permission to finally buy the boat, the second vehicle, the larger home, near the grandchildren, the memberships and subscriptions that make daily life feel a little more comfortable. None of these choices are wrong on their own. The trap isn't the first upgrade. It's the 10th one, arriving quietly enough that no single purchase feels significant, until the totals tell a different story. A retired engineer described it honestly. "I didn't buy one expensive thing. I bought 40 small ones, over 4 years, and somehow that became more dangerous than the one expensive thing would have been." This is lifestyle inflation, a slow, almost invisible expansion of spending that rises to match or exceed whatever income is available. It rarely announces itself. It simply becomes normal, the way a home's temperature rises so gradually you don't notice until you're uncomfortable. Seneca warned, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more. That is poor." Retirement income, however comfortable, can be quietly outpaced by comfort itself. If a man never pauses to measure the difference between what improves his life and what merely fills it. The engineer began a simple practice, reviewing every recurring expense once a quarter, asking only one question about each. Does this still add real value to my life, or has it simply become a habit I stopped noticing? He canceled nearly a third of his subscriptions and memberships. Nothing in his daily life felt smaller. His bank account, however, felt considerably larger. The goal was never to stop enjoying retirement. The goal was to make sure the enjoyment was intentional, not automatic. Fear does strange things to a man's financial decisions, especially after 60, when the years remaining to recover from a mistake feel shorter than they once did. This fear often pushes men toward an extreme kind of caution, pulling everything into cash, avoiding any exposure to growth, treating every investment like a threat rather than a tool. A widower in his late 60s, still shaken by watching his portfolio dip sharply during a market downturn years earlier, moved almost everything he owned into a savings account. It felt safe. It felt responsible. For years, he slept peacefully, believing he'd protected himself completely. What he hadn't accounted for was a quieter, less visible risk, the rising cost of everything around him, slowly eating away at the purchasing power of money that wasn't growing at all. His caution had protected him from one danger while exposing him, unknowingly, to another. This is the trap of scarcity mentality taken too far, where fear of loss becomes so strong that it blinds a man to the slower, quieter loss happening in plain sight. Loss aversion, the psychological tendency to fear losses more intensely than we value equivalent gains, had convinced him that doing nothing was the same as doing something safe. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Sometimes the fear that feels protective is actually the very obstacle preventing wealth from growing at all. He didn't need to take reckless risks. He needed a conversation with someone who could help him understand the difference between reckless risk and necessary growth, a distinction fear alone had never allowed him to see clearly. Safety and stagnation are not always the same thing. There's a particular kind of financial trap that doesn't come from spending too much. It comes from being unable to resist spending, simply because something appears to be a bargain. A retired postal worker described his garage, filled with tools he'd purchased over the years, because they were too good a deal to pass up. Discounted equipment, clearance electronics, second-hand furniture bought because the price was low, not because the need was real. Individually, none of these purchases seemed significant. Together, they represented thousands of dollars, spent on items he rarely, if ever, used. This is present bias, meeting a different kind of temptation, not urgency, but perceived scarcity. The fear of missing a good deal today, even for something unnecessary, can feel more emotionally urgent than the abstract benefit of simply keeping the money. Epictetus taught, "Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." A bargain only saves money if the item was something you actually needed in the first place. Otherwise, it's simply a smaller amount of money spent on something that still wasn't necessary. The postal worker began asking himself one simple question before any purchase, regardless of the discount. Would I still want this if it weren't on sale? More often than not, the honest answer was no. The fastest way to build wealth isn't always finding better deals. Sometimes it's needing far fewer of them. There's a temptation, especially in social circles built over decades, to speak openly about finances, what you've saved, what you've invested, what you've inherited or plan to leave behind. It feels like honesty. Often, it becomes vulnerability, disguised as openness. A grandfather in his 70s mentioned casually, during a family gathering, that he'd recently received a modest inheritance from a relative. Within months, 3 different family members had approached him separately, each with a reason why they could use some of it more urgently than he could. He hadn't done anything wrong by sharing, but he learned, uncomfortably, that once financial information leaves your hands, you lose control over what happens to it in other people's minds. Seneca advised that a wise man reveals himself carefully, understanding that nothing is so certain as that the evils of idleness can be shaken off by hard work. In this context, the modern equivalent might be simpler still. Nothing invites financial pressure faster than unnecessary financial transparency. This isn't about secrecy, born from mistrust. It's about discretion, born from experience. Wise senior men learn that privacy about money isn't dishonesty. It's protection for their peace, and often for the relationships they care about most. He didn't stop being generous with his family. He simply stopped narrating his finances out loud, understanding that what people don't know, they can't quietly resent, request, or expect. Silence, used wisely, can be one of the most valuable financial tools a man owns. This is where every trap in this video reveals its shared root. The father who overextends himself financially for his children isn't struggling with generosity. He's struggling with boundaries. The man who holds a losing investment isn't struggling with strategy. He's struggling with emotional attachment, disguised as patience. The retiree, drowning in small purchases, isn't struggling with money. He's struggling with awareness. The widower hiding his savings in cash isn't struggling with safety. He's struggling with fear, disguised as caution. Every trap in this video wears a different mask, but underneath, they share the same face. A man reacting instead of reflecting, moving on instinct instead of intention. The senior men who build wealth fastest after 60 are rarely the ones chasing the highest returns or the boldest opportunities. They are the men who quietly plug the leaks, the unnecessary spending, the unclear boundaries, the emotional attachments dressed up as financial decisions, the fear disguised as prudence. Real wealth was never only about what flows in. It was always, just as much, about what silently flows out, unnoticed, until a man finally sits down and pays attention. So we return to where we began. What if building wealth after 60 has less to do with what you buy and more to do with what you finally stop doing? A wise senior man doesn't need a better investment strategy nearly as often as he needs a clearer understanding of his own patterns, the quiet leaks, the emotional purchases, the boundaries he never set, the fears he never questioned. You've spent a lifetime earning money. The traps in this video aren't about earning more. They're about finally protecting, with clear eyes and a steady hand, everything you've already built. True wealth was never only the number in your account. It was the discipline to notice where that number was quietly slipping away, and the wisdom, finally, to stop it. If this reflection meant something to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Senior Stoic Wealth. We publish new reflections for men who are done chasing and ready to live wisely. Before you go, I'd like to ask you something. Which of these financial traps do you recognize most clearly in your own life? Share it in the comments. Someone else reading it may finally see, in your honesty, the trap they've been standing in without realizing it.